the logistics of speaking on podcasts and securing interviews for yourselves, I'm not going to lie, it's the reason we built the agency, is because it takes a lot of time. There's a lot of follow-up, emails get missed, schedules go awry, and people can't make things, and things might need to be rescheduled. And also, as you mentioned, you receive dozens of pitches and intros on a probably a daily and weekly basis. So how do you cut through that noise? And it's understanding the best way to cut through that noise. My advice is the same advice I give for anything: is add value. Do the work for the podcast host. Explain how you feel that you could benefit the audience of the podcast host. Because the majority of the times, the 99% of the podcast hosts want to serve their audience. That's why they've been the host for such a long time, or over a period of time as well. So make their job easy. Don't say, I can talk about A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, G. Maybe suggest one topic that you could explore.
Welcome to the B2B Digital Marketer Podcast, a podcast helping you to end your struggle with digital marketing, helping you to pave a new and better path to target and capture your ideal customer. Each week, we teach you how insiders and experts debunk the dreary and become engines of innovation. Now, here's your host, Jim Rembach.
Okay, B2B DM gang, I'm excited. We're going to have a great conversation today. This particular interview that we're going to have is actually built upon one that was started right when COVID hit back in March, 2020. And so I'm really looking forward to catch back up with Mark Colgan. Mark, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jim, thanks for having me. And yeah, great to reconnect.
Yes. And Mark is definitely one of those people who has, a lot of things, going and in the fire and the hopper, as they say. But some of the things that he's working on right now are, really very impactful to organizations that are trying to, build a brand, stand out, build a sales funnel, but not, or I should say, with not some of the thinking that you may have. And that's where Mark, having him on the show is so important. So Mark, if you could, help get us this discussion going by telling us, what should a B2B digital marketer, be asking themselves today?
Sure. So I think the first thing that any B2B digital marketer should be asking themselves is really, do they know their customers? I think that's the number one thing a marketer should be asking themselves, and what they should do. I come from a background of sales, so I'm not afraid of picking up the phone and speaking to people. In fact, it's what I had to do day in, day out. So there's no resistance there for me to do it. But I truly understand the customers that I serve and work for, and I really understand what their challenges are, not just in the sense of how my product or service can help them, but also what are the other challenges that they're facing, because it's very unlikely that you as a marketer are able to solve a problem that solves all of their challenges. So your service or solution might only cover one or two things that are on their bullet point list of things keeping them up at night. And as much as it's cliched to say, it is really important to know what keeps your customers up at night.
Well, we also had said, prior to us, recording, that, people also have to be thinking about the actions, activities, and strategies associated with short-term, thinking and results, and then long-term thinking and results. And so before we get into that, if you could just share a little bit about your background and experience with the B2B DM gang.
Yeah, so I've been in B2B sales and marketing for pretty much my whole career. So around 13, 14 years now. I started off in recruitment, which is sales and obviously recruiting people. I moved into HR and worked for one of the largest technology companies in the UK. And then I moved into a marketing role, and I worked my way up in various positions to be a head of marketing for a software company. And then that brought me to a sabbatical, which I think we talked about last time, Jim. I went traveling for a year. I like to say it was an early retirement, but I just didn't have enough money to stay for longer. So I had to go back to work. And then when we originally spoke back in 2019, 2020, I was managing a 100-person remote company. So I'd gone from a consultant by myself to managing a 100-person remote company. And that was all around lead research and data enrichment. So it was more of the outbound sales. And then more recently, so for the last year and a half, I've been managing and building Speak on Podcasts, which is a podcast guest booking agency, which is actually a really big combination of my matchmaking skills from recruitment, my outbound sales of like how to reach out to podcast hosts, and marketing from how do we position our customers as awesome guests to these podcast hosts.
Okay. Thanks for sharing that. Now, a couple of things that we were talking about is, the post-COVID explosion of podcast registrations and starting up of podcasts. And then we also started talking about the whole podcast attrition rate, where there's such a large number that drop out after, 10 episodes. An even bigger hunk, or I should say of the remaining ones, a big hunk of those drop out, before even hitting 50. And I talked about how I'm just so hard-headed and I've been doing this for over 7 years and have a couple podcasts, and that longevity. I mean, for me, when I start thinking about it, and part of the discussion that we had is it's had a different effect and impact, as well as, outlook that I have on podcasting. And I think it would be important for you to actually, give us some insight and understanding of where things are now. Also, when you even start talking about booking agencies, I mean, I have about 10 or 15 that are pitching me clients all the time. I mean, I almost need an admin just to handle that. Kind of help us understand the landscape and the impact.
Sure. Okay. So a lot to unpack there. I'll start with the growth of podcasts. So I personally believe that when COVID really hit and people had to readjust their plans, anybody that was going to be doing in-person events couldn't do those in-person events. Any company and demand generation team that relied on, or marketing team, that relied on conferences, that couldn't happen anymore. So a lot of people pivoted to setting up podcasts or speaking on podcasts. And I do remember at the very beginning, there was a little bit of a concern that listenership would drop as people aren't commuting, because that's one of the places where people listen to podcasts the most. I think we did see a small dip in the listenership, but it certainly rose back up after. So for me, those are the main reasons why podcasts grew so much in 2020. And also there's a really low barrier to actually get started. Ideally, you have a microphone and ideally you're recording it through Zoom. So you might have to have a paid Zoom account, but if you could actually get away without using a microphone as well. So therefore, the barriers to entry to starting a new podcast is very, very low.
Okay. So then when we start talking about, everybody starting podcasts, and then you also, parlay that and look at into the whole metrics associated with podcasts. I think it's important to talk about expectations, because goodness, I've seen a lot of, let's just call them podcast coaches, that say certain things. And I'm like, I don't know about that. I question it. So if you could see if you can set us straight a little bit.
Yeah, so I like to think about things a little bit differently. And what I often will say to our customers is that it's actually not about the interview, or it's not all about the interview. From speaking on a podcast, obviously the interview is very important. You have to be prepared. You have to know what you're going to talk about. You should know your anecdotes and your stories and examples so you can deliver value. But that's just the beginning point of a relationship that you can build with the host. So we speak to our customers on a regular basis, and a lot of the customers that we work with, they go on to negotiate affiliate deals or joint venture partnerships with their podcast hosts, because this is a reputable person that has an audience already. And if you can find a win-win-win solution, then you may as well explore those opportunities. Another thing to keep in mind, and we might touch upon this a little bit later, Jim, is that in the sales world, there's a stat from Chet Holmes from 2007, which says only 3% of any audience is actively buying right now. So whatever service or solution that you have, only 3% of people are proactively looking for solutions. So it means that 97% of people aren't actively looking, or they don't have a need, in simple terms. So by having your own podcast and speaking to guests and bringing on experts that help people become the hero of their journey, and you're the guide that helps them through that, you're creating content that when those people do have a need, or they do require some help, and they go out there and search, they may come across the content that you recorded months and months ago. And Jim, I'm not making this up. I had a LinkedIn connection request from a podcast that I was on 2 years ago, just this week. And they said they wanted to speak to me about what I was speaking about 2 years ago.
Yeah, that context and putting that story around it is, I think, where oftentimes there is conflict because, hey, I need to get a customer today, right? Not put somebody on the potential books 2 years from now. There's, I can't cash that, right? That doesn't go in the bank. And so it's one of those scenarios where, people struggle. I actually saw a picture of you on the internet where you had a picture of a funnel.
Okay.
And within that funnel, you had bracketed off to the side, and we're really focusing in and honing in on the middle part of the funnel. And you said, start here first. Now, I know I'm putting you on the spot, but if you could explain what you mean by that.
Sure. So that is it was a funnel for a SaaS company. So you have your awareness, acquisition, activation, you have your retention, revenue, and referral, known as the pirate metrics because of R. So that's where it comes from. And when I work with companies or when I'm just offering advice, I always say, start with the conversions of what you already have. Let's improve what you're already doing before we put more volume in the top. And other people will use the leaky bucket analogy. That particular image, I do know which one it is now. It's on a whiteboard, I think. And we're talking about the onboarding process for software users. So if you have a software and you're a B2B software, for example, and you haven't optimized your onboarding process, then the people that are signing up to use it, whether it be a free trial or even a paying customer, are going to go through and start to experience your product and dramatically fall off the cliff. All that effort, all that hard work you've done to get their attention and their desire and for them to convert is completely lost because you're not moving them through the onboarding process like you should. So in that instance, starting at the activation part of the funnel is really, really important before you start then to put more volume and more leads in the top of the funnel.
I think that's a great insight. Now, if you can, because for me, as you're talking about it, and as I first saw that, and my perceptions of that image, it aligned with some of the things that I've been talking about in regards to content creation, content marketing, and I started thinking about some of the similar concepts that you were talking about of where I should focus my attention. Mm-hmm. And what I see is that a lot of people are, really trying to do as much as they possibly can to just get people on that top part of the funnel. And so the breakdown does happen. It's like, okay, once I get, some of those people in there, there's no execution on conversion, right? So,
mm-hmm.
You talk about the whole, 3% are buy now customers. I've even seen stats where it's like under 1%. It's just crazy. But the point is that there are literally millions, if not billions, when you start talking about pieces of content that are all top of funnel types of, pieces of content. And so then what that means is if I'm focused in on top of funnel content, now I also have to be thinking about search engine optimization. I have to start thinking about linking strategies. And it's like, whoa. I think I'm putting way too much responsibility on top and focus on top when I just need to really have something that's going to get me leads and I can, create content that's going to support the actual conversion process. And that's where I should focus. Because if I don't have customers, creating all this other content's not going to matter.
And also, Jim, depending on no matter what vertical you're in, there are going to be some Goliath companies in that vertical who are also serving the same market. So let's just say I am a CRM consultant. I can help people set up their CRMs. There's no point me creating some top of the funnel content because I'm never going to outrank Salesforce. I'm never going to outrank HubSpot without a significant amount of effort and budget. And if it's just a solo business or even a small to medium-sized business, it's just not worth the effort. We only have a finite amount of time. So like you, and I also agree, start closer to the conversion and help people make those decisions because the buyer's journey has changed. I believe it's something like 76% of the buyer's journey is now done before engaging with a salesperson. So there's people looking for content, they're listening to podcasts, they're searching in communities, they're asking their peers. It's word of mouth, it's referral. The last two pieces of software I bought, albeit not big purchases, one I heard the founder on a podcast and he sounded like an interesting guy. I checked out his software and it was a need that I had. The other was a recommendation from somebody in a Slack community that I'm in. They said, check out this tool after I said, I'm looking for a X category tool. They said, check out this one. I've used it. I've been really happy with it. That's how I made my decision. It was like, I didn't read any content, Jim. I just asked my peers, or I looked in my network.
Okay. So I think that's a very important point, because for me, my interpretation was really, if I'm thinking about the middle of the funnel, it's all the relationship elements.
Yeah.
It's not the information elements that are sitting up on top that's going to make the difference. The conversion comes in the relationship elements. So, and to me, I think that's part of your gift of having that outbound perspective. And even when you explained what you did from an outbound perspective and how you talked about, solving people's problems and helping to solve problems, what you were really talking about is I worked and focused in on building the relationship.
Yeah.
Even when you started talking about the whole top of the funnel and the short term versus the long term, you talked about a relationship. And I think that for me, what I'm finding is I listen to more people who have had success. When I look at these case studies, and there's a lot of muddying that goes around the fact that those that are most successful, really what it comes down to is that they're better at creating relationships.
Absolutely. And to take that one step further, you can be smart with the relationships you want to develop as well. So I use the example of, I'm never going to outrank HubSpot. I'm never going to outrank Salesforce in my CRM example. I'm using an example, hopefully that resonates with the DM gang. But I would reach out to HubSpot's content team and Salesforce's content team and say, hey, can we produce some content together? I've got this insight. I've got that insight. I've done this throughout my career. I've reached out to other people who are serving my audience that aren't directly competitors to me, and see if I can deliver value. One of those was Mailshake, which is an outbound sales email software. I reached out to them. They rejected me the first time, so I tried somebody else, and they said yes, and I got back in. And from doing a very short, I think it was only a 15-minute mini webinar, it was almost like a podcast interview, I generated 8 leads. I closed 4 of them because these people were ready they had the need and they needed a solution. So rather than me creating this top of the funnel content, I just went and found somebody who serves the same audience, whose audience also have the problem that I can help solve, and then positioned myself as the guide to help them overcome their problems. And I think if more marketers thought like that, then they would be a lot more successful. However, the rhetoric from management and from the big blog posts of the big MarTech companies tells you need to have a blog, tells you need to be on all of these social channels. So it is difficult. And I really do appreciate that I'm in a very privileged position where I can just make up whatever I do. Whereas I remember working in a marketing organization with a team and having people reporting to me and I'm reporting to them. I couldn't just do wild card ideas and see if they work. So I do understand the challenges of those that are working in a much larger organization.
I think when you talk about the rhetoric, I also had somebody say something to me a couple of months ago about also the platforms, Facebook, and especially in business, we're focused on LinkedIn, and he said something along the lines of, LinkedIn has done an excellent job of convincing us all that we need to give away information about us on their platform. And I was like, we've been conned. Yeah. So but it is what happens. So when we look at this social influencing and the impact that is brought on, needless to say, it's some massive revenue that's behind it and driving it. And so we have to really take that rhetoric that you're talking about. And much like I said a second ago, before we started recording, is, maybe just take that with a grain of salt. Don't put as much credence and weight on it as we should. Okay, so now let's shift a little bit to the whole guesting, podcast, production and hosting, and talk a little bit more about this whole expectation setting, because you and I had some communications off mic, and we kind of hit on it a little bit here, talking about near term, short term. But if I'm sitting here and I want to be a guest on a podcast, what can I really expect?
Sure. Okay. So there's a number of things that you can expect. And what I'm going to do is fast forward a little bit, Jim, assuming that people have an idea of the audience that they want to speak to and also some topics of value that they can share. If they're struggling and thinking that, oh, I don't have anything of value to share, I remind people what's obvious to them is often amazing to other people. And also just think about the three most common questions you get from your prospects and customers. That is enough to start with. At least you can build out upon there. The logistics of speaking on podcasts and securing interviews for yourselves, I'm not going to lie, it's the reason we built the agency is because it takes a lot of time. There's a lot of follow-up, emails get missed, schedules go awry and people can't make things and things might need to be rescheduled. And also, as you mentioned, you receive dozens of pitches and intros on a probably a daily and weekly basis. So how do you cut through that noise? And it's understanding the best way to cut through that noise. My advice is the same advice I give for anything: is add value. Do the work for the podcast host. Explain how you feel that you could benefit the audience of the podcast host, because the majority of the times, the 99% of the podcast hosts want to serve their audience. That's why they've been the host for such a long time or over a period of time as well. So make their job easy. Don't say, I can talk about A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, G. Maybe suggest one topic that you could explore. As I also do deliver some training for sales reps. And one of the biggest shifts that I've seen in the last year and a half is having a softer call to action in your emails. So the old advice was to say, hey, Jim, if you want to, can you meet me tomorrow or Tuesday at 4 p.m.? Nobody woke up in the morning wanting a sales call. Nobody wanted to book that demo when they got out of bed in the morning. So having a softer call to an action like, are you open to learning more? Do you think your audience would find this valuable, is a much more effective way to get those replies. Because look, we're looking to start a conversation, not close a deal or secure an interview or book a meeting in that one email, because it's back to what you were saying, Jim, about relationships.
Okay, so now let's think about the other side of the coin when we start thinking about the host and the podcast and all of that. Whether I'm starting a podcast or even being a guest, I need to think about a couple different things, because ultimately we're doing this because hey, we have to feed our family. I mean, everybody could say that, hey, I want to make a dent in the world and dent in the universe. I want to make a difference in the. I mean, well, that's all fine and more altruistic, but the fact is that if we're not supporting ourselves and our family, it's all for naught, right? So we have to really focus in on, how do I create more relationships, get more clients or customers, and close deals? Because and that ultimately that's what it's all about. What can I expect as a guest, as far as that's concerned? And I think you mentioned an example earlier where you talked about 2 years later I got a connection. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, if I'm starting a podcast, what can I expect? And where does a podcast fit within my marketing?
Great. Okay. So as a guest, what can you expect from speaking on other people's podcasts? So the first thing, I think the most important thing is you are going to be able to reach a new audience that may have never heard about you before. And if you've done your research right and selected the right podcasts to go and speak on, then there should be some people within that audience that you could potentially work with. And what you're really looking to do is start building that relationship and offer as much value as possible. I really like to give the advice to tell people about your F-ups, tell people about the success stories, be raw and authentic, because we still buy from people at the end of the day, and that's never going to change. So I go on podcasts, I'm honest, and if I'm allowed to swear, I'll swear. If I have to keep it PG, I will. I'll tailor my delivery to the audience, but I am being my authentic self. And I think a lot of people buy into that. I say this quite often as well, is the moment I stopped selling, I started selling. So when you're not coming across as that commission breath car dealer that's trying to sell a secondhand car, and you're there to help somebody drive away with the car that they're looking for, that's a much better position to be in. So going back to benefits for being a guest. So starting to build relationships with an audience that you may not have been able to reach before is probably the number one. The second major benefit that I believe from speaking on podcasts is that you have just created 20 to 30 pieces of content from a 30 to 40 minute conversation. How you could do that is you take the recording once it's been published, You can put it through a tool like Otter, which will transcribe it for you. There's another tool called Descript. They do the same thing. And that essentially, a 40-minute conversation is around a 4,000 or 5,000 word blog post. Now, edit that out with removing some of the fluffier bits, and you've got maybe 2 1,000 word blog posts, which you could then break down into smaller chunks for social media images. You might have the video. So Jim, you're smart with your podcast. You put it on YouTube as well. So there's video content that you can use as well. So you want to repurpose this content in lots of different ways. And then the possibilities of actually distributing that are almost endless. We see some of our customers send out their podcast interviews in their newsletters that they send to their customers and prospects. One of our other customers, he sends snippets of videos to prospects that are in his pipeline. So as they're going through the sales process, a lot of people are like, well, I don't know what to follow up with other than saying, are you going to buy? So he uses the content that he's created from speaking on podcast as a way to do that. There are other benefits as well. So from an SEO point of view, the backlink juice can be pretty strong from the podcasts because I'll often point back to your website in the show notes. And then the more direct, and this is a really hard question to answer, is how many leads will I get from each podcast interview? And I first of all say, well, number one, it depends on how good of a speaker you are. Secondly, how good has your preparation been for not only how you're going to deliver, but if it's the right podcast and if you have an offer that's of interest to those people. So we do recommend to our customers that if they do have an offer, some of them might have a quiz, some might have an ebook, some might have like the first chapter of their book, for example, or their full book. We help them craft a really clear call to action and make sure that they have a lead capture and nurturing system behind the scenes as well, so that they can actually take advantage of that newly converted leads. But I wouldn't be able to sleep at night if I told every customer you're going to generate X amount of leads per podcast interview, because it simply just doesn't work like that. It doesn't mean it's not important. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be getting your brand out there and reaching a whole new audience, because remember, 97% aren't looking to buy right now, but they will be soon.
Yeah. So for me, as you're talking, I started thinking about that whole cumulative effect. And that's kind of what I also had mentioned before, is, when I started, podcasting 7 years ago, and where I am today, you have different things that come about that have you look at the effort quite differently. So like for one thing, I never saw forthcoming was the amount of really knowledge gain. As I say, it's an education I've never been able. There's no way I could pay for it, right? And I don't think when you start thinking about continuous learning and growth, being on, as well as hosting a podcast can be very, very powerful. So well, you talk about the whole lead magnet piece. You talk about the recommendations. You mentioned quiz. You talked about things, but I still keep going back to that picture of middle funnel. So if I do look at your guests and clients, and even your own, guesting on podcasts, what do you say, can you say that there is something that actually is, higher performing in regards to those calls to action?
So it's very nuanced, Jim. So if you've got a $200 course, then this call to action might be better. If you've got a $5,000 mastermind, then a different call to action. So really, when you go up the price chain, let's just say, and I'm making this up on the spot, Jim, because I haven't been asked to kind of put this in a matrix just yet. But the lower price thing that you effectively are trying to sell, the lower or smaller the offer you may need to convert those people. So, for example, if I wanted to sell a mastermind which cost $20,000, I want to get on a phone call with that person who's interested, or I might have them going to a webinar, which is a pre-recorded webinar as well. If it's so I'm just trying to think of the recent sales processes I've been through. There's a coaching course for $1,500, and their call to action is a webinar, which then has a drip sequence after. And if you're interested in working with them on an ongoing basis, so that doesn't require any human touch. That's pretty much all automated. That $20,000 that $20,000 decision someone's going to make, you probably want to offer a strategy session or a clarity call or whatever you want to call it. And then for some of our customers, they use an SMS system to say text the word book to 5525, and we'll send you a copy of our book. But again, they're playing the long game. They're not looking to necessarily close a deal off that. And I would encourage people to not look at closing immediate results unless you're direct to consumer. And Jim, we have a few customers that are B2C. One of them is a fantastic collagen-based protein powder. We placed him on a podcast where he gave a $5 discount code off, and he changes the code for every interview that he goes on so he can track them. And from one podcast interview, he got $6,500 worth of orders from that podcast. And that was within the 48 hours that they went live. So it can work. It just depends on your objectives and also what it is that your services or your product does.
Well, as you're talking, I'm saying, hey, you have to actually do a yeoman's work of creating the proper strategy before you just launch and start.
Absolutely.
Participating. So if I was to say, where you are now and where things are headed, because one of the things that I had mentioned is that there's a lot of organizations that have now launched that are doing similar types of work. As what you're doing. So if I start talking about differentiation, if I start talking about competitive landscape, because much like podcasts have just, we pre-COVID, there was a report of, like a little over 1 million podcasts. And I think, you looked it up before we started recording and said Apple has like 2.3 million podcasts registered. I mean, the explosion and growth has just been crazy. And so what that means is, there's more and more out there, and so you start continuing to build this cumulative effect of, additional, people, either as content creators, but not as many content consumers. They're getting less when you start looking at the ratio. So, what tell us a little bit about your market analysis, I guess I'd say, in this space.
Sure. Yep. There's no shortage of people offering a similar service to what we do. And I'm sure there'll be many more that start up as well. In a way, anyone that's established now has a little bit of a head start. But here's where I think our winning secret sauce is: we don't automate stuff. We do everything manually. So we charge a premium for our service because we take more time with what we do, which leads us to create quality results for our customers and not take advantage of automation. And I know that 90% of companies that start to be a podcast booking agency are going to automate it. They're going to send the same message to 20 or 30 different podcast hosts, or even 100. But what they're actually running the risk of is damaging the reputation of the customers that they're representing. And that is the last thing that we want to do. So one of the differentiators that we don't really communicate too much, but I've been asked this a couple of times now, Jim, I might have to update the website, is that we actually care. We care that it's a relevant podcast for you. We're not just here to hit the number. And there's been 1 or 2 campaigns where they're based on the audience requirements of our customer and the topics they wanted to talk about. There wasn't that many podcasts to reach out to in the first place. That the total addressable podcast market for them was actually quite small. So rather than just saying, okay, let's just put them on these podcasts because we know that they'll take them as a guest, we turned around to our customer and said, hey, look, we've done a great job. We've enjoyed working on the campaign, but there's just not enough podcasts. So we're going to either refund you for that last month, or we're not going to charge you for the last month of the campaign. And just having that honesty and just making sure that it's relevant podcasts. I think that's what we keep coming back to, is relevancy over everything.
Well, I mean, it's a reoccurring theme with you, which is the whole relationship piece. To me, that's you're talking about another secret sauce. It's that is a primary focus of yours, and you want to preserve it and not violate it. So thanks for sharing that with me. And I think you bring up a really interesting point too, because as I had mentioned, I get pitched quite a bit, and I had one that just kind of stood out to me in the past couple of weeks, where it was different size fonts within the message. It was very broken in its English, but yet they were pitching somebody who, based on the organization they worked for and things like that, I thought was maybe a, premium and guest. I mean, because the reality is as a host, we're trying to determine and rate and evaluate, the guests that are coming on the show too. So it's like, that was just incongruent. I'm like, is this for real?
Yeah.
And I questioned that. So, when you start talking about in your mind, and I know we can't validate this, but if you look at the percentage of organizations that are out that are attempting to do, a lot of the promotion versus, the elite and things like that, does it fall in the same scenario and outbreak of, 80-20? Or is it different?
I would say 80-20. There are competitors out there that I respect, and I think they do a great job, and I wouldn't be afraid to say that. But there's a huge majority that don't do a very good job at all. And what you're witnessing as the host there is the fact that it's automated, that email. The difference in the fonts is that there's a template, and then they've attempted to customize a paragraph there. And then, so maybe they've made a bit of an effort, but if it's broken English, it's like, do you really want your brand to be shot to pieces from a reputation point of view? So just make sure that you're vetting the companies you're going to work for. Of course, everyone's marketing website is going to say that they're the best agency in the world. But if you go to our website, Jim, and go onto our testimonials, we have more testimonials from podcast hosts than we do of our own customers, because they love the outreach. They enjoy working with us. We do everything we can to prioritize the level of service they receive. We have two customers. Well, only one pays us. We have the entrepreneurs and the businesses that we help place on podcasts, but we also have a customer in the podcast hosts. And we know that investing in that relationship and delivering a great service means that it might make our life a little bit easier in the future if we've got this great rapport with the podcast host. That doesn't mean that all we ever do is reach out to people that we've previously secured interviews for. We personally start the research from scratch, because it's, again, about the relevancy. But yeah, like I said, I've worked as a marketing automation consultant. I know what I can automate and I know what I can't. And I know we could automate this, but I also know that we shouldn't automate it, because it really is the key differentiator in what we do.
I think that's one of the hardest decisions to make. Okay, so talking about other decisions, is I'm sitting here and I have a lot of these opportunities. I can do a lot of things, from a marketing of my business perspective, and I can do a lot of things. As far as content creation and development, I can do a webinar, I can do, blog posts and all of that. I can do, but there's only one of me. I don't scale, right? So how can I make my best decision and invest my money wisely if I am a, either organization, or an entrepreneur that's wanting to sell my products and services to other businesses?
Yeah, and if you believe that podcasting is a good channel for you to explore, and you have an audience which is listening to podcasts, okay, so we have to remember, where is the audience? If they're not listening to podcasts, or you can't identify them, then podcasting isn't the right channel for you in your business. But if it is, you've got three options with podcasting. If I was to keep it simple, you can speak on podcasts, you can create your own podcast, or you can advertise on podcasts. Now, I don't know as much about the advertising on podcasts, but what I do know as a consumer of podcasts is I skip the ads as soon as I hear them. So personally, if it was my business, I wouldn't be advertising too heavily on podcasts. I would maybe use that as part of my strategy, but not go all in on it. So then let's just say we've eliminated ads, not to say that there's not a place for them, because there is. You've got speaking on or creating your own podcast and launching that. How much time do you have? I think that would be the main question I'd then ask. And then if you don't have that much time, then speaking on other podcasts where you get to leverage a pre-built audience might be a good place to start. See if you like podcasts. I think so many people you mentioned, they either produce one episode or 10, and after that, that's where they all drop off. They may not have enjoyed it. They just felt like they had to do it. So by speaking on podcasts, you might say, I really enjoy this. This is something that I want to spend more time doing. And you might turn around and say, I hate it. I get anxious. I get nervous. I'm sweating as I'm speaking. This isn't perhaps the right medium or platform for me. So it does come down to a personal preference too.
Mark Colgan, I've had a great time chatting with you today. If you could, please share with the B2B DM gang how they can get in touch with you.
Sure. So you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. My name is Mark Colgan. That's Colgan. Always happy to talk to anybody via LinkedIn. If you're interested in speaking on podcasts, you can visit speakonpodcast.com/strategy. And there you can book a call with me where we'll go through your audience topics and potentially highlight some podcasts that you could reach out to by yourself. So I want you to walk away having the right confidence to go and execute yourself.
Mark Colgan, thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom, and we wish you the very best.
Thank you, Jim. Great to catch up again. Speak soon.
Thank you for joining us. Go now to join the B2B DM gang in the B2B Marketer LinkedIn group, where you can connect with other B2B DM disruptors and get access to our B2B DM cheat sheets, checklist, and guides. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, please help by going to iTunes to rate, review, and subscribe. And share the show on all of your digital platforms. Be sure to tune in next week for our next episode. And always remember, you can automate your lead capture, but you must lure your lead.